In this paper, I set out with an anachronistic, at first sight, rather flawed task, if you will, to find a modern medical biological concept and trace it back in ancient science, namely what in contemporary biology is named metabolism. As I try to do this, I will have, as I hope, the chance to discuss, first of all, the status of metaphor in the production of scientific knowledge, and secondly, an ecological approach to history of medicine, or medical physiology in this case. In this way, I hope to contribute to the study of how environmental factors shape the way in which we understand the functioning of our body. I gave a first version of this paper at the Deutsches Archäologisches Institut in Istanbul, where the discussion was rather a more archaeological one about the Pergamon territory and Galen under the heading of social metabolism. So the word was used metaphorically there. I am very much indebted to the discussion that we had at the time and to the comments that I received on that occasion. But here today, I would like to focus on the doctrinal medical part rather than the archaeological and socio-historical one. Considering the outside world as functional model, its ecology as image and mirror for the functioning of the individual human body, but also as key factor in its functioning. Now, metabole means change in Greek. No such technical term as metabolism, in fact, is found in Greek. If you look at the meanings of metabole, the word metabolism mimics and it shows to come from, the meanings are rather common in general: change, changing, exchange, turnover, the idea of change and exchange, payment by transfer, so monetary, in space, eclipses, migration, and then also military term, literary style, and music. So the terminology is not really particularly physiological. The term metabolism is used by various authors in the fields of chemistry, biology, and medicine, prominently from the first half of the 19th century onwards, in the sense we give to the word metabolism. Now, this Google tool is not 100% accurate, of course, but it gives you a bit of an idea of how the term metabolism, not the concept, of course, but the term, begins to be used in the 19th century, and there is a peak, of course, in the second half of the last century. I say in the sense in which we mean it nowadays. And what is this sense? What is the understanding of metabolism when we use this word in biology or also in everyday discussions? Well, a definition for it is the combination of chemical reactions within the body cells, which are aimed at changing food into energy. Of course, this formulation is very, anachronistic and impossible to map on ancient medicine as it stands. Additional elements in the definition and concept are the fact that you can distinguish metabolism of substances coming from the outside. So this is intended metabolism in the more general meaning of it, holistic metabolism, or gesamte Stoffwechsel in German. Metabolism of substances present within the body, so-called intermediary metabolism, hormones, and the changes of different substances within the body. Then you have within metabolism, the distinction in between anabolism, the building up of molecules from simpler ones requiring energy, and catabolism, the breaking down of complex molecules into simpler ones, releasing energy in the process. So the lack of our own chosen term, of course, for these topics in ancient medicine and science does not mean, obviously, that the research question and inquiry did not exist before. And in this paper, I will try to both address this point, the historiographies of metabolism or on metabolism, and emphasize at the same time the environment as a notable ancient element in it. Most of the points that I have just mentioned have to do with nutrition processes, the consumption of food and drinks by the body, and respiration. As such, it is a truism that they should be shaped very literally by, or indeed be equal to, our relationship as organisms to the outside world. And this is immediately evident in Galen's discussion. Now, when I said, again, that there is no word for metabolism in a literal sense in ancient medicine, although the term is Greek in origin, I didn't mean even that an explicit thematization was not there. And something that approaches this was found in Galen. And the nearest terminological option is found particularly in a passage of his on the natural faculties, in which he analyzes vocabulary of change. The word in Greek is kinesis. He distinguishes two kinds of kinesis, alloiosis and phora. And I just read from the relevant passage. He says, if a body undergoes change in any respect, we then say that it undergoes various kinds of motion, polluedos kinesthesitai. The first type is that of a movement of bodies, a qualitative motion, kataton tempo ioteta kineste. Color and flavor, for example, when a warm thing becomes cold and a cold warm, when anything moist becomes dry or dry moist. The common term, which we apply to all these cases, is alteration, alloiosis. This is one kind of motion, but there is also another kind, he writes, which occurs in bodies which change their position, or as we say, pass from one place to another. The name of this is transference, phora. So we can recognize then kind of two different kind of kinesis, movement in space. We could also say travel or change in one's position in space, and alteration through exchange. Two versions for Galen of somehow the same phenomenon, or at least to be associated within the same discussion. So accordingly, I propose to tackle my topic today at these three levels. First of all, spatial change, a movement of bodies, change in place and environment. To just explain it a bit with a bit more words, the journeying of bodies, traveling human beings, be their physicians of patients. Secondly, there is also what I call metaphorical change, the mimesis between exchanges in animal life and in the natural and human environment. In Galen's work, in fact, there is a notable penchant for environmental similes and parallels. On various occasions, clinical and physiological narratives resort to imagery involving, in particular, landscape, urbanistic context, tending and gardening, and waters. Now, this semantic exchange is not a decoration in Galen's text, but I propose an understanding of an analogy between body physiology and world, in particular, the presentation of the body in the world as city to landscape, a body whose health is shaped by interchange with and movements in the environment, which we shall see. I will focus particularly on this cluster of imagery. And then the third point, there is the account of the qualitative changes within the body, how our body receives substances and alter them to support life, alloiosis, as he has called it, our intermediary metabolism, maybe the one we will recognize more promptly as corresponding to what we call metabolism in modern and contemporary biology. I will look at these three in sequence, starting from movement in space, so somehow altering the order that Galen had mentioned in his discussion that I quoted earlier. And although this paper is on the metabolism of the body, I begin just where the intuition of this connection I have outlined started for me, the world and the variations within it as they shape changes and reactions in the body, as observed in the natural environment, waters, vegetation, earth, climate, winds, and human landscape, cities, habits, recipes, practices, and in the working of foods, drinks, substances. I shall start from the most experientially immediate aspect, which is that of travel. Now, travel and Galen, of course, is a topic that brings us to the biography of Galen, not only as a matter of curiosity, but because this shapes very much his observations and his interest in dietetics and environment. Galen was, as it is well known, a high-flying, extremely wealthy and mundane member of the upper classes, and as such, a great traveler. This is a map that I have and a list of places he visited that I have reconstructed based on Vivian Nathan's great biography of Galen. He emphasizes a lot how much of his doctrines and activities can be mapped also on his geographical and cultural movements across space. And as you can see here, and I have put a list reconstructed precisely from Vivian Nathan's book, between Pergamum and Italy, Rome, and Greece, and Egypt, with a variety of different turns and trips. So he was a great traveler, as much as a proud Pergamene citizen. At the same time as this, and because of this, he was also a great observer of human life and human organized life. His writing testifies to both his travels as well as the very many comments on landscape, changing places and environment, changing diets, the produce, the technique, the ways of preparing food, and ingredients, of course, when you turn to pharmacology. It is not really a case, then, a fortuitous case, that Galen's On the Property of Foodstuff is a great document on travels and places as well as on dietetics and food. And here I want to quote just two examples from this work that are, I think, useful for what I'm trying to explain and, of course, very relevant to metabolism. The first example is the quality of the fish at the estuary of the Tiber, from On the Properties of Foodstuffs, and bread or porridge in the Pergamum countryside. Now, the first example, the quality of fish in the vicinity of Rome, and I just read from the translation. As I have said, he writes, it is important to bear in mind with all fish the following common denominator, that the worst fish are nurtured at the mouths of every river that flushes toilets, kitchens, baths, dirt of clothes and linen, and everything else that is to do with the city that they run through, which must be washed away, and especially when the city is densely populated. The flesh of the Maori that lives in such water is found to be extremely bad, although it is impossible to find it either entering rivers or breeding in lakes. But nevertheless, the very worst is found at the mouths of these rivers, like the one which flows through Rome, which is why this fish alone is the cheapest of all those from the sea are sold in this city, on a par with the fish which breed in the river itself. Some people call this fish Tiberine since they have a distinct appearance that does not look like anything else which lives in the sea. So in this comment about the property of certain fish, Galen associates urbanization and the particular urbanization of a densely populated urbs, of course, city like Rome, and its ecological impact with the quality of water, the geology and hydrology of rivers and particular positions within a river, the quality of the ichthyc fauna in terms of nutrients in the flesh, and its goodness for the human organism. So in the second example, he speaks about something that happened to him as he was traveling in the countryside with a companion, and finding himself somehow strained away from the city and very hungry and tired, and they didn't have anything to eat. They stumbled upon a couple of people living there in the countryside who offered them to join them for dinner. So they went there to their place, and their wives were preparing some bread, which was not baked or prepared as bread is, through kneading and yeasting and then baking, but it was just a kind of porridge made by boiling it with water. So they ate it because they had no other choice than that. They ate a lot of it because they were tired and very hungry, and as a consequence, they felt extremely sick. They couldn't digest. They had constipation. They were sweating and feeling extremely sick. And then they asked the two hosts if they also had, if they ate this bread very often, if they had the same experience, and they confirmed that they were forced sometimes, just as Galen was on that occasion, to eat this porridge, but that they also found it very hard to digest. And of course, and this is Galen's comment based on this anecdote, how is that surprising? Everyone knows that wheat is a very strong ingredient, but it needs to be processed. It needs to be mixed with yeast. It needs to be kneaded. It needs to be baked. It needs to undergo a kind of metabolism itself. And then it becomes a very powerful, energetic food. Instead, if it is eaten somehow jumping these intermediate steps, then it can be extremely difficult to digest. I think this was a fair report on the text that is missing. So at this point, you have, in this particular passage, then you have a direct parallel between change or metabolism in the sense of traveling, being far away from home, coming across strangers, the kind of cooking, boiling, and preparation that a certain foodstuff has to go through, the metabolism of the digestion that or failure to digest of a certain food, and the details, as I said, in the technique of food preparation. Here, as I said, in the negative, what was not done by these two women in the preparation of this bread. Now, the whole book is very rich in details and anecdotes, as well as in concrete examples linking habits, geographies, substances, and the ability of the body to digest and assimilate. I now move to my next example, which is my next set of my next metabolic level, so to say, which is that of metaphorical change. So a mimesis between exchanges within animal life and within the natural and human environment. Now, Galen is very fond of gardening, vegetational imagery, and a lot of environmental imagery of various kinds. But for my purpose today, I focus in particular to city and countryside, which is really central to the construction of metabolism. First of all, Galen speaks of roads leading to the city and comparing them and uses them as image for the vessels leading to the liver. And I read from a passage in the commentary to Nature of Man. All vessels which bring the juice coming from food from the stomach and the intestines to the liver, so all of those reach into it at just one point, which they call the gates of the liver, pyllas hepatos, giving originally the appellative of gates to that place by analogy between the liver and a city or large house, while the intestines and the stomach are its countryside, agroi, from which, as if through kinds of long roads, the ahodontinon pollon, the vessels, food arrives into the gates of the city or house. A second example is that of the veins as city porters. Just as city porters, aktophoroi, carry the wheat cleaned in the storehouse to some public bakery of the city, where it will be baked and made fit for nourishment, so these veins carry the nutriment already elaborated in the stomach up to a place for concoction common to the whole animal, a place which we call the liver. It has a single entrance, but this divides into many narrow passages. And long ago, some men well versed in nature's lore, I suppose, called it gates, the pyllas, a name which has persisted ever since, approving the wisdom of the first men who likened the governance of an animal to that of a city. Now, of course, it is very clear that the teleology of Galen's view of nature sustained this whole environmental imagery. For example, again, not on metabolism here, but just to give an idea of another metaphor being very productive in qualifying the body in a certain way, the spine, rachis, is like a city wall, as he comments in the Uso Partium, one of the most teleologically formed of his writings, for the spinal medulla. It is fortified with many ramparts all around it. He very clearly says in the Uso Partium that nature can be seen as a city founder, a wise city founder. Nature is like a good oikistes, who not only takes thought for colonizing, for founding a city in the first place, but also plans how the city may be maintained always, or at least for a very long time. So not only nature creates a body that is very strongly and rationally formed, but also looks after its maintenance for a long time, for the future to come, a kind of metabolism, a self-implementing system that should last forever. He also adds a bit later in this passage that city founders are still remembered and celebrated nowadays because cities don't last for so long. So the memory of man can still contemplate who founded a city, while nature conceals itself precisely because its work is so good and fine that it has lasted for such a long time that its name has been, so to say, forgotten or become hidden. Going back to our metabolic urban imagery, there is the distribution within the body from sources as efficient aqueduct, and this is perhaps the most complete of the images that I have shown. He writes, just so in bringing fresh water to a city and distributing it, the experts have made one very large aqueduct connected to the source and have sometimes portioned out some of the water to certain other places even before it reaches the city. Or if they have not done this, at least they have distributed it within the city to all parts of it in such a way that no part is without water. So it has to be distributed in a fair way in the different parts. And precisely as we approve particularly of those who do not only distribute the water to all parts, but likewise do so most justly, so we shall praise nature too if we find her wholly just. So this idea of the perfect functioning of the body within the body is a distribution, but also a distribution in a just way, in a ten nomen dikaiotaten. This dikaiosyne here has not only to do with quantity to the different parts of the body, but also with quality, as we will see a bit in a moment. Right. So in this representation of the body as a city, I propose metaphors are not just explanatory, but really have to be understood in a teleological light and as a way to kind of compare and make the body understood in terms of the environment, and the environment also conceived as a kind of body. Now, Galen, the traveler and observer of city and land, understands here the human body and its physiology as an organized community in a relationship with the world outside, shaped by the exchange of resources and influenced by changes in the environment, for example, the availability of certain produce. I turn now to the third metabolic level, as I have called them, of my presentation, which is somehow the real thing, physiologically speaking. So the one, as I said, as I anticipated, we would more readily recognize as metabolism, the qualitative change. Namely, the fact that substances change within the body, so the so-called Stoffwechsel or intermediary metabolism. Now, to frame the importance of this chapter in Galen, I think it would be useful to give some context of metabolism in history of our history of biology and medicine. And of course, this will be very short and it will have a lot of gaps, but I think it's useful to understand the meaning of environment in this kind of discussions in our tradition and the role of Galen there. I have called it somehow shamelessly a 30 seconds history, and I hope you will forgive me for that. So it is not only about Galen and our topic, but also about how the narrative in our historiography of medicine is built. When I say historiography of medicine, I mean the typical histories of metabolism, histories of a certain concept or chemistry in medicine, that tend to be longue durée and cover the whole developments from antiquity until today. Here you have a short bibliography that I have a selection of all those that I have been going through at the Wellcome Trust this summer, trying to kind of have a framing in historical terms to this discussion. Some are better than others, but just to give an idea of the kind of long narratives where one then trying to understand the archaeology of a concept, looks for the ancient origins and finds origins or antecedents and finds the emphasis placed not always where one would expect. So historians of science generally agree, if variously, in seeing the specificity of metabolism in the modern sense in the rise of biochemistry, which means the application of chemical research on the one hand and quantitative measuring on the other to medicine and health. To contextualize the place of Galen, I was quite puzzled to see that within the stories, Galen was pretty much absent from the narratives. The pointers tend to start with Paracelsus and his interest in substances and chemistry, the substances present in the world as active and having an influence on the body. There are then various steps in between him and nowadays to mark this itinerary in the discussions of metabolism. And again, I am aware of the simplification. This is also not my primarily field of study, but important steps are Santorio's quantitative, the focus on the quantitative aspects in medicine and their immiseration, and then a number of topics and pointers which I think students of scholars of ancient medicine would also recognize, such as the discovery of oxygen and respiration in those terms, Lavoisier, Crawford's study of animal heat or calorimetry, Liebig's study on balance and the chemistry of food, to arrive to intermediary metabolism in the 20th century, seen or given a particular importance as the marker of life. In fact, in the 20th century, in current biology, the focus is more and more on intermediary metabolism, what happens inside the body. The transformation of substances inside the body is seen as one of the key defining marks for life itself. The living is distinguished from the non-living precisely by its ability to develop a line of reproduction and to effect a convenient metabolism. Now, this line of research, this summary, seems to might appear to have moved in a direction which I sum up as individual organism centered. To eat and grow are individual enterprises, and more dominated by a central quantitative question. In more recent times, however, biology and medicine have more and more been opening up the perspective, granting space to the world, the environment, and elaborating concepts of macroorganisms or superorganisms. Again, here these are just pointers and inspirations from current trends in certain fields of biology that I've been looking into. Examples are cooperation as criterion of life, the notion of superorganisms, and the regulation in general of the relationship between self and non-self, which engenders new notions of individual identity, which are different from the previous organism-centered ones. And here are some of the texts that I have found inspiring and useful, in particular Duprey's article and Pradot's work on immunology. In this kind of, again, short history, what about ancient medicine? Ancient medicine is usually summarized, and I go quickly through this, invariably in all the papers and works that I've been looking at, with the pointers such as the Papyrus Ebers and his discussions of the Egyptian papyrus from the second millennium of humorism and digestion. Of course, the ancient Greek medicine's contribution to dietetics, starting from the Hippocratic regimen and other dietetic recommendations there. And then throughout, Greek medicine to arrive to Imperial Age nosology, the often very detailed accounts of digestions and dietetics, and the description of a variety of what we would call metabolic diseases, such as diabetes, cachexia, stomachicon. These are those that you can more easily identify with metabolic disturbances, but many others, contain descriptions that could be appreciated by doctors nowadays. Now, Galen, in this kind of narratives, is absent, and I found this quite striking and very interesting because, in my opinion, and I think it is pretty clear, especially if one reads the natural faculties, Galen is the first to formalize the question of metabolic processes and the problems that they are supposed to solve, which is how can black become white, so to say? How can one particular substance become a body? What is the energia, the activity that allows milk to become bone or blood? Which are the steps, the intermediate steps needed? How and on what conditions is this particular kinesis executed? What is the role of the environment in this, whether implicitly or explicitly acknowledged as such? Now, the problem, as Galen spells it out in the natural faculties, nobody, he writes, will suppose that bread represents a kind of meeting place for bone, flesh, nerve, and all the other parts, and that each of these subsequently becomes separated in the body and goes to join its own kind. Before any separation takes place, the whole of the bread obviously becomes blood. So there must be intermediate steps before assimilation can be effected. And in more detail, it's worth reading this, I think, in full. The action of the nutritive faculty is assimilation, and it is impossible for anything to be assimilated by and to change into anything else unless they already possess a certain community and affinity in their qualities. Therefore, in the first place, any animal cannot naturally derive nourishment from any kind of food. And secondly, even in the case of those from which it can do so, it cannot do this at once. So it needs a distribution and change, and also it is a matter of timing, so to say. There are certain steps that are in a certain pace that is needed. Therefore, by reason of his law, every animal needs several organs for altering the nutriment. For in order that the yellow may become red, and here there is a whole chromatic metaphorical realm that he uses, and the red-yellow, one simple process of alteration is required. But in order that the white may become black and the black white, all the intermediate stages are needed. How then could blood ever turn into bone without having first become, as far as possible, thickened and white? And how could bread turn into blood without having gradually parted with its whiteness and gradually acquired redness? Thus, it is quite easy for blood to become flesh, For if nature thickens it to such an extent that it acquires a certain consistency and ceases to be fluid, it thus becomes original, newly formed flesh. But in order that blood might turn into bone, so when the distance is greater, much time is needed and much elaboration and transformation of the blood. Further, it is quite clear that bread, and more particularly lettuce, beet, and the like, require a great deal of alteration, digestion, in order to become blood. This is the first phase of the transformation of nutrients in the body. Another important, and then here the order is the one in the text, but of course not in the metabolism. Excretion is the second, is the outcome and final stage when you have discovered bodily parts of a second kind consecrated to the removal of the superfluities of the food. And then there is distribution, that part that he so clearly in the other text that we have seen expressed through the metaphor of the city and the roads. There is also a third kind for carrying the pabulum in every direction. These are like a number of roads intersecting the whole body. Thus, there is one entrance through the mouth for all the various articles of food. What receives nourishment, however, is not a single part, but a great many parts, and is widely separated. Do not be surprised, therefore, at the abundance of organs which nature has created to the purpose of nutrition. For those of them which have to do with alteration, prepare the nutriment suitable for each part. Others separate all the superfluities. Some pass these along, others store them up, others excrete them. Some, again, are paths for the transit in all directions of the utilizable juices. Now, all these are a theorization of what happens inside the body, how the body allows the nutrients reaching us from the world outside to become body through a chain of alterations, distribution, storage, and discharge. The illustrative connection between the physiological processes in what is observed in the world and in human activities, however, in a well-organized city, for example, is an illustration of the working of nature, not a mere explicative metaphor. The model of the city-countryside exchange mimics metabolism, but also human technique does. Consider the example of fermentation that he gives. Who does not know that brine and seawater preserve meat and keep it uncorrupted, while all other water, the drinkable kind, readily spoils and rots it? And who does not know that when yellow bile is contained in large quantity in the stomach, we are troubled with an unquenchable thirst, and that when we vomit this up, we at once become much freer from thirst than if we had drunk very large quantities of fluid. So here we have a parallel between what happens in the body, yellow bile, and the effect of a certain natural substance, salty water, brine, salty water in the found naturally, but also brine used to preserve meat. Another similar case and example is the technique of wine production. One can understand about the humors from a comparison, and I read the underlined part. Imagine that some new wine, which has not been long ago pressed from the grape and which is fermenting and undergoing alteration through the agency of its contained heat. Imagine next two residual substances produced during this process of alteration, the one tending to be light and air-like, and the other to be heavy and more of the nature of earth. Of these, the one, as I understand, they call the flower and the other the lees. Now you may correctly compare yellow bile to the first of these and black bile to the latter. So again, the line of comparison is not only from nature to body, but also from human technique and use of the different substances and what happens inside the body. So to illustrate the question of metabolism, I have started with travels, I have continued with similes and metaphors, and then I have turned to physiology. All these are levels of representing the interactions between bodily physiology and health and environment. Galen of Pergamon's life and writings testify to a living and moving scientist trained in the environmentalist observations and theory of the Hippocratic tradition, among the other things, accustomed to the changes and exchanges between people and environments, and their meaning for health and therapeutic affordances. Another chapter here would be, of course, the pharmaceutical ingredients, availability, recipes, and places, but this would be, of course, a much larger topic, but highly relevant to this. Galen also observed, theorized, and understood processes changes and movements of substances in and out of the body and within it. Metabolism proper, with our definition, as delivery of nutrients to different body parts, but also transformation in a sophisticated and fitting way, not less so than our own, the contemporary one, if not for the unavailability of microscopic data. Now, by saying this, I do not wish, of course, to offer any concept of linear progress in the development of a scientific idea of metabolism, so to say, for example, large to small or microscopic, world to body or imagery about scientific ideas to proper science of the body. I don't want to propose an existence of such a linear progress and then patronize Galen into having had intuitions of this or that, account of metabolism. I propose instead to recognize a shared cognitive level between itinerant medical observations, textual imagery, and elaborations of physiological doctrines. They all share a common set of questions, those of kinesis as movement and alteration, which engenders environmental awareness and the problematization of nutrition and the chemistry of life in dialogue with the world outside, which constitutes metabolism. So the connection between these three levels is deep and not casual. Trends in current biology, as I mentioned them before, emphasize interconnectionist factors such as cooperation and altruism as criterion for life, as well as ecology and superorganism. And this is again the slide that I had showed before. Again, I'm not here to establish a fancy analogy between current extra-individual biology and Galen, but rather to make the smaller claim that Galen, on this important chapter of human physiology, had an important contribution to make in showing the importance of collaboration between individuals and the environment for life. And here I conclude my presentation, just leaving you with a wonderful view of the city of, the view from the Acropolis of Pergamum, and also a statue of Galen in person. And thank you very much.